This is the YouTube on the skin parts and terms to know. I'm going to show you these parts on the models only here. To get out this form, you can see we're going to cover the three main regions of the skin. Then we'll do the epidermis layers, the dermis layers, some pressure corpuscles, look at some hair structures, and some gland structures. All right, we have two skin models, that one and this one. So first, let's get the three main layers. The epidermis, remember epithelial tissue, from here up, all cells. Dermis is going to be the pink connective tissue, hair down to the fat layer, which is going to be the hypodermis. Dermis is the thickest in the middle. Remember, derm means skin. So epidermis on top of the dermis, hypodermis under the dermis. Now, we have 5 layers of the epidermis. I only have 4 on your list because the one layer is only in thick skin, but they do show it here. So we start from the bottom of the epidermis. We would have the stratum basale, one layer thick, one layer, cell layer thick at the bottom. Basal for bottom, base. And remember I said these are the ones undergoing mitosis, which replicate pretty fast. And as they replicate, they push up. So I picture them as spinning out and moving up. So this second layer, which can be the thickest, is the stratum spinosum. And then they start to get more and more keratin in them, and they will get darker here. I know that's not darker, but the next layer up is the stratum granulosum. Here, the white is the layer I'm not having you memorize. It's the stratum lucidum because it looks a little lucid, gets a little clear type of fat in it for extra cushioning and thick areas of your skin. And then the top layer is always going to be the layer of cells completely filled with keratin. Most of the time they've died and merged together. Stratum corneum. So all these are keratinocytes on this model. We don't see any, we can't see any melanocytes or Merkel cells or Langerhans cells. We cover them in lecture. We're just covering the keratinocytes. And as they replicate, they move up, they fill more and more up with keratin. So by the time they reach the stratum corneum, they've died and merged together, making a nice protective keratin layer to our skin. Here they've kind of cut them away there. Stratum basale, then the spinosum, then the granulosum, then the lucidum, then the stratum corneum there. In the dermis, we have 2 layers. Papillary layer sticks up into the epidermis. Remember, papilla means protrusion. They create these little protrusions here. You can see the papillary layer. And they will actually stick up into the epidermis and create these fingerprints, these ridges on your skin. But that's the papillary layer of the dermis. And all the rest of it from the papillary layer down is the reticular dermis, because remember, reticular means a network, and you can see there's a network of structures here in the reticular layer. Muscles, hairs, glands, nerves, blood vessels, all kinds of things. 2 structures we're going to cover are to detect pressure, and they're called pressure corpuscles. The Meissner's corpuscles are up there. They detect light pressure because they're higher up, and they're going to be in the papillary dermis. And then the Pacinian corpuscles are going to be deeper. Here's one here. They look like onions, especially when they're cut open. Deep pressure, Pacinian corpuscle, Meissner's corpuscles in the papillary layer. You can see they're going to have nerves connected to them. So if somebody presses on your skin just a little bit, it starts a nerve impulse in the Meissner's corpuscle, which continues along nerves to your brain. Here's a nice Pacinian corpuscle with nerves. Now the hair structure, you can see nicely here. The shaft is from the epidermis up. Some books say from the outside of the skin up. And the root is definitely in the dermis. There. Now the root is covered by what we call a hair follicle. And that's a little sac around the hair that actually makes the hair follicle. And attached to the hair follicle and feeding into the hair follicle is going to be the sebaceous oil gland there. It secretes oil onto the hair. Connected to the hair follicle also is this muscle called the Erector pili muscle, because erector means it makes the hair stand straight up, erect, when it contracts. And also pili means hair. This also, when it contracts, squeezes the sebaceous gland and makes it secrete oil. You can see the layers of the hair follicle, which is full of keratinocytes that make the hair. The hair is keratin also, just like the outside of the skin. Here we can see a cut view, like a sagittal cut through a hair. This is actually the hair itself in brown. And then this kind of purplish gray outside of it is called the hair follicle. This little protrusion inside the hair follicle is called the hair papilla. Sometimes they call it the hair matrix. That's the very active part of the hair that's making keratinocytes, which are filling up with keratin and pushing that hair straight up. The hair follicle makes sure the hair goes straight up instead of laterally. Now the glands, and the other thing I want to show you about hair is it has a nerve connected to it. So anytime somebody moves your hair, even a little insect crawling on your skin, it moves that hair, stimulates this nerve, it goes to your brain. It says there's something crawling on me, or I have an itch. For the glands, there's two kinds of glands, sweat glands and sebaceous glands. I kind of already covered the sebaceous glands. But again, in case you missed it, sebum means oil. So these sebaceous glands are named sebaceous because they secrete sebum, which is oil. And they secrete it again onto the hair, which then travels up the hair, keeps the hair moist and keeps your skin moist. And it's also protective against, can be protective also. This is a hair here, and then the sebaceous gland around it. See, the other thing here is the sweat gland. And you can see the sweat, you can tell it's a sweat gland because it has a tube leading all the way out to the outside of the skin. So the sweat tube is coiled structures. On the microscope, we said they look like kind of like cross sections of donuts, but the sweat is being created in that secretory part of the sweat gland. And then once the sweat is secreted, it goes up this tube and is secreted out a pore, sweat pore. And the sweat is meant to, sometimes it excretes waste, but it also has some acid and some lysozymes in it to kill bacteria on your skin. Also, of course, it helps you release heat when you get overheated, because see how these blood vessels are close to the sweat glands? And remember, blood carries heat. So if you want to take that heat and get rid of some of it, two things can happen. The blood vessels can dilate and move up closer to the edge of the skin to help release heat, or the blood vessels can put that heat from the blood into the water of the sweat, and then the sweat can carry it out. And then once the sweat evaporates, it takes the heat with it. This is another kind of sweat gland here. It's a big one. Now that's the one that was in your armpits and anogenital area. And on your list, there are parts to know. We separated sweat glands into eccrine and apocrine. Well, I covered this one, which is the eccrine. Think of eccrine, E for everywhere. That's everywhere. But the apocrine sweat glands, think of axillary armpit and think of anogenital area. And they secrete more of a fatty type sweat, which smells worse than regular sweat. And the reason it smells is the fatty substance it secretes, bacteria just jump on that and break it down into an odor. These would be like scent glands in animals. So they're much bigger, the apocrine sweat glands. But they still have the secretory part, and they still have the secretory duct, or tubular duct, and then the pore. That would be an eccrine, everywhere sweat gland. So that pretty much covers the skin. I'm going to show you this other model and point out some things here. So we'll go quickly through the list now, maybe not in order, but epidermis, hair up, epithelial tissue, connective tissue, the pink, the dermis, and then we have the hypodermis, the fat. As far as the layers of the epidermis, basal layer at the bottom, spinning out spinosum layer. This shows a nice granular layer here. And they don't have the lucidum on this. So then we go straight to the stratum corneum. For the dermis, we have papillary layer protruding, and then we have all the rest of it's reticular dermis. For the corpuscles, we have the Meissner's corpuscle, light pressure, and the papilla, and deep, either reticular dermis, I think it showed a reticular dermis on the other model, or it could be in the hypodermis, the Pacinian corpuscle for deep pressure. In the reticular dermis, again, we can see blood vessels. They should have nerves in there. That looks like they're showing the nerves in black. There. And then we have the hair structures. We'll start over here, where they cut part of the hair off sagittally. So this brown here is the hair, and the hair root would go all the way up to here, where it has the follicle around it. And this would be the follicle in purple, the hair follicle. There's some other layers we're not going to learn. But hair follicle, hair root. There's your hair papilla, full of very active keratinocytes, analogous to the basal cell layer of the epidermis. This hair follicle is actually epithelial tissue that has come down into the dermis. And again, the hair follicle is guiding the keratinocytes to produce that keratin to make the hair grow straight up. And the hair is keratin just like the stratum corneum, but it's a little bit different consistency. And around that hair, this would be the hair shaft from the epidermis up. Around that hair, we can see this nice sebaceous gland here, sac of oil-producing cells. And then we have the erector pili muscle. I like the way they have it here because it not only shows it can pull on that hair to make it stand erect, but you can see here how if it contracts, it's going to squeeze that sebaceous gland there and make it produce oil. Sweat gland, they're only going to show one here. That's the secretory part. The tubule and the spore, pore, sweat pore. And then we have lots of blood vessels in the skin, we said. Of course, all the cells need nutrition. They need to get rid of waste. We have arteries and veins, and we have capillaries. Blood vessels are close to the sweat gland to help transfer heat. That should be it for the skin. Make sure there's nothing back here. Okay.